you're relaxing on a nice Spanish beach. Despite World War II raging all around Europe, here is a serene piece of land out of its reaches. You see something out in the distance bobbing in the water. At first you think it's just driftwood, until you realize it's in uniform. It's a man, and he's dead. You take him out of the water, and you find there's still a briefcase stuck to his arm. In that case, all of the Allies' invasion plans are hidden. You think, well, what is this luck? You finally got something useful that you're going to be able to hand over to your German allies. You think you've done a good thing for the war effort, and that this will certainly win Germany the war. Little do you know, you have single-handedly doomed the German war effort in World War II. Operation Mincemeat was a complex operation to fool the Germans into believing that instead of invading Sicily, the Allies planned on invading Sardinia and Greece in that summer of 1943. They were able to do this by taking a dead body, which they found at just a random morgue, strapping on a uniform, important documents, and other personal effects like a picture of who's playing his wife, love letters, a extensive paper trail, so that when the Spanish found him and did an autopsy, and when the Germans found this information, they would completely believe it, completely tricking them so that they would draw their forces out of Sicily, which is what made Operation Husky, which was the Allied invasion of Sicily in World War II, so incredibly successful, and they took the entire island in the span of a very, very short time with barely any casualties for the Germans or Americans. And the main people behind this plan were Ewan Montague, Charles Cholmondeley, Francis Hazelden, Admiral John Godfrey, Jean Leslie, and Hester Leggett. The body they used, they named Major William Martin, which is what was on all of his documents that they gave him, but later they found out that his real name was Glendower Michael. They didn't know who he was initially, as he was just a random homeless man who they found dead on the streets, who had ingested rat poison, but nobody felt good about the fact that they had just used a random body. They hadn't tried to find out who he was or contact his family. So eventually, 50 years down the line after this operation, they were able to do that and make up for it. Now, why would the Allies realistically choose to invade the Balkans as opposed to invading Italy? There's a few reasons. Number one is, compared to Italy, the Balkans were relatively underdefended. Overall, there were more troops, or maybe even just about the same amount of troops in the Balkans. The difference is they were playing an offensive role rather than a defensive role. There are a lot of very famous resistance movements in World War II. The most famous ones would be in Poland, in France, in Norway, or Denmark, because those are Western countries. But what is very little talked about is how influential the Balkans were and how big resistance movements they had. To the point where, going into 1944, things like the PLF, or Partisan Liberation Front, which would have been in Yugoslavia, had more troops than the Germans did in Yugoslavia, and completely liberated Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia without any Allied help whatsoever. And then you have other organizations like the Sacred Squadron in Greece, able to liberate most of the islands in the Mediterranean without Allied help, having all of these massive success stories despite not being very talked about. Because of that, the Germans had to ship down a lot of troops. So yes, in the Balkans, there were a lot of German troops, but they weren't in defensive positions. They weren't having the same kind of massive machine gun nests and fortifications on the coastlines that you would see in Sicily or Normandy. So it would be much easier to actually land there. Number two is that countries in that area as opposed to Germany or Italy, would be much more willing to surrender. If we say that on a scale of 1 to 10, Germany is like a 10, fully committed to the war, fully fascist, then we can say that nations like Romania is like a 7, if even that, maybe closer to like a 5, and Bulgaria is probably closer to a 3 or a 4, as Bulgaria did not want to be involved in the war in the first place. So even in our own timeline, the moment the first Soviet soldier entered Bulgaria, or hell, before that, they were trying to sue for peace and immediately got out of the war as soon as they could. Same thing with Romania, that the moment troops started entering Romania, they immediately just threw in the towel and gave up. So, while yes, Italy did surrender relatively quickly in our own timeline, landing near Bulgaria and pushing in would see almost immediate victory there, which could very greatly favor the Allied war effort. From here, we can see the division to invade the Balkans being made in 1942 probably, where they would hope to land outside of Athens, in Greece generally, and work their way up quickly to Bulgaria, and then make connections with organizations in Yugoslavia to hopefully liberate all of that. Operation Mincemeat would go the same as normal, going very well and successfully tricking the Germans, except, of course, not to move their troops out of Sicily, but move them into Sicily instead. We could probably see troops being pulled out of Greece, the Western Balkans, Sardinia, and likely southern France into Sicily, which would again make this operation a lot easier, as the Allies would be planning on invading Sicily and invading Greece, to do the exact opposite of what happened in our own timeline. And from here, the Allies would coordinate with that same Sacred Squadron and Greek resistance movement to then, in 1943, around the same time that Kursk is going on in the Eastern Front, they would land at Sardinia and land in Greece. Sardinia would be practically having no defense at all and be immediately taken by the Allies. And we could see a similar thing in Greece, where they were able to land very successfully and push in before the Germans are able to reset themselves in a defensive posture. We could also see probably Crete being taken as a base to act into Greece. From here, there would be a race to cross the Balkan Mountains, as compared to Italy, the Balkans were very similar. They were very muddy, they were very mountainous, and progress would be slow and hard. So if they were able to cross those Balkan mountains very quickly, they could see much more progress than if they're trapped on the other side of them. This would be similar to our own timeline, where a rivalry between the Americans and British would see this rapid advancement to where probably American tanks under General Patton would be able to reach the mountains in the section in Bulgaria probably fairly quickly. And from here, Bulgaria would probably have already surrendered, as they would see it as pointless and see their entire nation getting taken over. On the western side of the Balkans, we could probably see German troops being moved in much quicker, so it would likely be slower, but once Yugoslav movements can coordinate with the Allies, we could see a massive push upwards, as even in this time, the movements were very big, and would be able to push up to around the same spot on the other side of the region. Massive advancements, we could probably see Germany deciding to be even tougher in the remaining pockets of the Balkans that they hold on the native populations. In our own timeline, they said for every one man that the Serbians and Yugoslavs shoot in the German army, I believe it was something like they would kill 7 civilians, which greatly helped the Yugoslavs, as the Germans were being so incredibly brutal that everybody was joining the Yugoslav movement to fight against them, and this would be probably seen tenfold, where the Germans are losing and they need to control this movement. They would try to do that, and it would turn out terribly, helping them in the west push further up, and we could probably see the first troops reaching Romania around this time from the Allied side, but due to Romania being pretty much one big mountain, it would be very slow and likely not cause an immediate collapse of the country, though they would start seeking to sue for peace. And this time would probably be where winter hits, so more or less all movement would be stopped, and we would see that same kind of thing we see in Italy, where there's all the mud, there's all the mountains, so progress becomes painfully slow. From here, we can see D-Day beginning to be planned and coordinated in the West, as once this stops, the Americans are going to want to invade France like they did in Italy once the Italian campaign stopped being as effective. And from here we can see D-Day being gone through on, happening more or less normally, being able to push into France, though it might be a bit more successful as the Germans have more to worry about in the Balkans than they did in Italy, and they would have probably pulled some troops out of France earlier when they were trying to fortify Sicily, so it might be a bit easier for D-Day to not only happen, but maybe push a little bit further initially in things like Operation Cobra. And at this point, the Balkan front could probably get moving a little bit again and move north to threaten cutting off Italy from Germany. That, in combination with being bombarded from Sardinia, and now the Allies being in France as well, you could probably see those same Italian resistance movements rising up and possibly beginning to start acting towards coupping the government. And at this time, we would probably see a new offensive being launched from all sides, where there's heavily pushes into France, into the Balkans, and on the Soviet side into the east. This would see major gains across the board, and Balkan troops with the Allies and Eastern troops with the Soviets meeting up in Romania, creating one united, massive front line between the two. And at this point, Romania would certainly surrender, seeing it as a hopeless situation where now every country is in their nation. Slavic forces, along with the Allies, are going to be able to completely cut off Italy and begin pushing into the north, which is going to cause the same revolution we saw in our own timeline, where Mussolini is killed, deposed, and it is creating a new republic in Italy. The only difference is German troops, there would likely still be some in Italy that could probably just be encircled and wiped out, while it could not be reinforced in things like Operation Axis, as now Germany has no access to Italy, making it fall much easier than our own timeline. And at this point, Germany is completely isolated. We can see all forces pushing in from every side like in our own timeline, where the Soviets still take much of the east, but not as much, as the Balkans are able to push up, and you can see a similar splitting of Germany between the two sides. And here we can start getting into the bigger effects to the larger world at this point as a result of this operation. The Balkan campaign would have been very bloody and brutal, taking much more lives than Italy did, as the Balkan mountains and terrain is just very brutal and would cause a lot of deaths to fight through, and there was a very, very heavy German troop presence in this time, which likely could be repelled by all of the Allies' tanks, but would take more lives in doing so. In addition, the Soviets would be very, very angry at the Allies, as the Soviets wanted the Balkans, and by the Allies just taking it without asking the Soviets and freeing all of those nations, the Soviets are going to feel isolated, they're going to feel attacked, and they're probably going to push towards the Cold War much earlier. And Yugoslavia would be a very interesting nation at this point. It would probably be very akin to post-World War I Poland, where they technically have a socialist leader and socialist organization in charge, but the nation itself is still not socialist, where it's still very much Western-backed and has a lot of West support, as they're the ones who really helped liberate it, and it would be on their side of the Cold War, while still having this mixed socialist capitalist government. The Balkans would be in a much better position post-World War II than they were in our timeline, as in our timeline they were put under the direct control of the Soviets, which nobody wants to be under direct control of the Soviets. They were all incredibly broke, incredibly suppressed, while in this timeline they would be included in things like the Marshall Plan, which would greatly help them rebuild from this war and make it so that they're much more advanced and much more stable than in our own timeline. From here, the Cold War would happen mostly probably the same, except since the Soviets control so much less of Europe and are so much less influential, it would probably end quicker with an American capitalist victory. Overall, this was a plan full of trade-offs, and while yes, it helped the future better, as the Americans, Brits, and Allies won the Cold War much easier, it came at the sacrifice of many thousands more lives being lost in the Balkans, as well as having to fight Italian troops for much longer, which took more lives and was just generally much more brutal, probably making it the second most brutal front of the war, only after Japan, of course, which, no matter how brutal the situations are in the West, in Europe, that doesn't compare to island hopping, making this very interesting, very different world coming out of World War II. And this is going to be the part where I ask you to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It means a lot to me, and there's just a lot of support I've been getting recently about this whole thing, a lot of people liking and watching these videos, and I really have to be grateful for that. And just, if you've watched this entire thing, I've already taken an extra 17 minutes of your life, so if you could just drop a like, comment, subscribe, anything would help. Giving advice to what you think could have been done better in this scenario, what you think a future scenario could have been, or just watching any of my other videos would be greatly appreciated. And that's about it. Peace.